I now recognize for 5 minutes Mr. Hice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And listen, I'll just share with what has already been said. This is looking really bad for you guys. And the American people hate to be ripped off. All of us, in any deal, hate to be ripped off. And this is one of those issues that is inexcusable, and why the money is not paid back to the American people is beyond me. Mr. Stein, let me ask you, how many long-term or multi-year contracts do you currently have with the government?
I do not know.
Mr. Howley?
I don't know. I don't know the number.
Can you give me a ballpark?
I just don't know.
You don't have any idea how many contracts you have? Isn't that the business you're in?
I think we provided a very long list of contracts to the committee here, and I think it was thousands. I don't believe most of them were long-term. We run 55 autonomous businesses that run with standalone management systems and run very autonomously. I simply don't know the number.
Can you get that number to me?
I believe we gave the number to the committee already. We gave them a list of all our government
Would you
contracts.
confirm? I would like to know how many long-term or multi-contract contracts there are with the government, and likewise for the subsidiaries. If you got 55, I'd like to have a ballpark, at least, of what we're dealing with. And it's amazing to me that the price gouging that's taking place, and you don't even know how many contracts you have. I want that information.
I think we've given that to the committee.
We'll follow up, and if not, I expect to hear.
If not, we'll give it to you.
That's what I want to hear. Mr. Fine, let me ask you this regarding contract splitting. Of course, this is where a large contract is split up into smaller ones to avoid anything from pricing threshold to helping acquisitions. In the report, or when you were going through this, how often did you see contract splitting? Either one of you, Mr. Fine or Ms. Hull.
We found 32 of our 47 contracts, or our parts that we looked at, were under the simplified acquisition threshold. But I can't speak to splitting of contracts in that regard.
All right, so explain that to me. You found, how does that work, what you described?
So the total dollar threshold of the contracts is what drives the need to provide cost information to the contracting officer. So in the 47 parts that we looked at, 32 were under the simplified acquisition threshold of $150,000 at the time.
So somehow that had to be made an agreement that this is a better route for us to go to get under the pricing threshold. Is that correct?
The company would have made a determination.
Somebody had to make that determination. Were you able to determine if it was Paradigm that made that request or that decision, or if it was the government?
The contractor in this case would be the one that would bid on the particular part for the government.
Okay, but there could be a situation where DOD, for instance, wants to simplify the acquisition process, and it would go more quickly with a smaller contract pricing threshold, correct?
Potentially. I can't speak to that for this particular audit.
Okay. That would be worth knowing. Mr. Fahey, let me ask you this regarding intellectual property rights. Is that ever considered when dealing with contracts and the contracting officers? Do they look at intellectual property rights?
So the answer is yes, sir. We look at intellectual property rights, right? I mean, that's usually more of the program manager who would give the requirements to the contracting officer of, do we own the intellectual property rights? And if we don't, do we have a situation like we don't think we have fair and reasonable pricing that we should reverse engineer it to get the intellectual property? Right.
So are you saying then DOD does currently have some intellectual property rights on what would otherwise be sole source?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So there is a negotiating process to try to address the problem that could lead to price gouging.
Yes,
by obtaining the intellectual property.
there is. The challenge here is it's usually easier to negotiate and get a fair, reasonable price for the IP early in a program, not when you're in an aftermarket spare parts situation.
All right, so do you include in that, say, first right of refusal on?
So that, I had mentioned earlier that we had done a report that we delivered to Congress last November. One of the recommendations in there was if you're in a situation where somebody is in sole source and owns intellectual property and they are going to sell it, that the government has right of first refusal to buy that intellectual property before they could sell it to somebody else like TransDigm.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman.